let me talk about Jonah, the prophet of the environment. Now, okay, there's nothing explicit about the environment in the story of Jonah, but it's a great allegory of how to do environmental awareness. And the situation Jonah is in is a situation we are in sometimes when we hold dear environmental values and other people don't. And then, should we tell them or not? And there's always peer pressure, so we're not sure we should say anything. I had written an article many years ago, and then that article actually inspired one of my friends, David Finn, who wrote the book Jonas, the Prophet of the Environment. It's a book in French, and it's this thin. It's not very big, but it really holds the ideas I'm going to be presenting in the next few slides. My friend David Finn, by the way, is a pastor in the United Church of Canada. So Jonah hears this. Get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message that I tell you. And it's really interesting to read this story with a map, because Jonah's there in Israel, and then he has to go towards the east, and just go into the east and walk hundreds of miles to finally get to Nineveh and proclaim this oracle from the Lord. But he gets scared. And why would we? A few kilometers from my home is one of the biggest cities, New York. As if I'm going to walk that distance and then tell them, sorry, people of New York, you are very sinful and God is mad at you, so you'd better convert. I wouldn't want to do that. So I can totally understand Jonah doesn't want to do that either. And so he flees in the other direction. He goes towards the west. And if you're in Israel and you go towards the west, well, you get to the coast, and then you take a boat, and then you just continue on the Mediterranean and try to flee. And that's what that's what he's trying to do. So he gets on this boat, and then there's a storm, and a big storm rocking the boat. And all of the people there, as lots of mateys on the boat, they would always try to find the culprit. Whose fault is it that we're stuck in the storm? And they ask around, and the main question is, who has insulted their God for us to be in this situation? And they finally get on the bottom side of the boat, and they find Jonah, who's sleeping. And they ask him, did you insult your God? Is it your fault that we're in the storm? And he says, well, yeah, I did insult my God. He called me to do something, and I didn't want to do it. And he says, so it's your fault. And they bring him, and they want to throw him overboard. And finally, he just volunteers, and he throws himself in the water. And then God sends a giant fish who will just gobble up Jonah. And Jonah shall stay in the stomach of the whale, the giant fish, for 3 days, 3 nights. It gives him time to ponder the situation, and we could call it a conversion. And he changes his way of thinking, and he's thankful that God saved him, and he accepts to do the mission that was given to him. So he finally is vomited out on the land, and I'm guessing he cleaned himself up. It doesn't say in the Bible, but I'm guessing he must have cleaned himself up. And then God repeats, he says, you must go to Nineveh and tell them the oracle. You shall tell them that they've been sinful and that they have to convert. Otherwise, the city will be destroyed in 40 days. So he walks hundreds of miles, finally gets to this huge city. There's a description in the Bible saying that Nineveh at that stage was so huge that it took 3 days just to walk from one end to the other. And so he gets to the door of one of the doors of the one of the gates of the city, and he starts telling people. He says, "This is what the Lord of the universe tells you. If you keep your wrongdoings, this city will be destroyed in 40 days." And he walks in the city and he just keeps on telling people. Very quickly, the news rises up to the king. And the king realizes how bad this city has become. He takes off his crown, takes off his jewelry, takes off his clothes, puts on some rags. He even goes and takes some of the ash, the cinders, puts it on his head, and he declares there's going to be fasting for a few days. Even the animals have to fast. And that is for conversion, recognizing all the wrongdoings and converting in the city, making the city better than what it was. And so the population follows, and they convert. And then Jonah's just waiting, and he waits for 40 days, 41, 42, 43, and the city is not destroyed. And the city's much better. And they've changed. And even Jonah is surprised, because we can read between the lines showing that even he has lots of prejudice against that city. That city had a bad reputation. And finally they change, and they're much better. So I take out a few things from this story that seem to apply to the environmental crisis and how I feel sometimes wanting to tell other people, but I don't want to be a party pooper all the time. So it's an example of the importance to announce a conversion. That God calls us sometimes, just for 5 minutes in some situations, to speak up and become a prophet. Not all the time. Most of us are not prophets all the time. But sometimes we get this specific mission to speak out. And it would be very uncomfortable to do so. So we should announce a conversion. And then, what I love about this story is that there's hardly any resistance. There's already a potential for change. So he's there to announce a prophecy, an oracle, and wow, the people are receptive. They just needed a little nudge. They needed someone to say it with a lot of conviction. So, do we need prophets today when it comes to the environment? Yeah. I'll tell you an experiment I've done. I was in my 20s, and I've kept on doing it, but there was one specific time that I really took this personally. And so whenever I would see someone idling their car, so the car was just running and the motor was running like that for no reason, the person was parked. Every time I would see that, I would feel that I had to say something. And being Christian, I try to do it with as much charitable spirit as possible. And so what did I do? I would knock on the window, and then I would have a big smile. I would point, and then show this, turn the key. Here are the results of my experiment. 8 out of 10 times, the person would go and turn the key. the person would realize that they weren't supposed to be wasting all of this gasoline, and some of them probably considered, why emit so much CO2? Why create this pollution if it's not necessary? So most of the people, 8 out of 10, converted. They changed their habit. Now, to be honest, I'm giving you my stats. 1 out of 10 times, the person wouldn't understand what I was talking about. They were just confused. And even though I did that, they had no idea. And 1 out of 10 times, the person would get mad. Now, the car's running, so the person didn't come out of the car or anything, but it just showed from the inside that they were not happy. And what I always consider is that I did it with a smile, very nicely, wanted to help them out so they could save money. And if the person is very disturbed by it, well, I'm sorry, but I shall continue my way, and I won't get into a big fighting discussion about it. What I'm trying to get at right now is that God calls us to use a prophetic voice sometimes. Sometimes He hires us just for 5 minutes, and we should say something. And we should be impressed by the fact that sometimes it can have a huge effect, and the person was just waiting for that nudge. And sometimes it can have a life-changing effect. Is there a story about climate change in the Bible? Well, a few times. There are a few droughts, that is climate change. But here's a story that involves Pharaoh and Joseph. And there's this quote in this story, which is, "The 7 lean and wretched cows ate up the first 7 fat cows." Why are we talking about fat cows? You'll see in a moment. So I call this one reading the signs, and you'll see why. So the story of Joseph follows the story of Abraham and the story of Isaac and Jacob. And now Jacob has 12 sons. There's Joseph. His brothers are very jealous and sell him as a slave. He runs into some trouble. He's in prison. He can read the he can read dreams. He can decode the symbolism and the dreams, and it catches the attention of a guard who brings him to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, who's been having nightmares, who's been having bad dreams, and it's the same dream that goes on and on and on, and he just does not understand it. And finally, the Pharaoh tells his dream. There are 7 fat cows that are eating the grass near the Nile. And then there are 7 mean and wretched cows that come out of the Nile, gobble up the fat cows, but they stay lean and unhealthy. And then practically the same things happens with wheat. The wheat looks good. There's 7 of them. And then finally some dried up, withered grain like envelops it, and we're left with that dry grain. Very sick looking. So what does it mean? And what happens is the Pharaoh asks him, well, now that we understand, what does Joseph say? Joseph said, well, this means 7 years of abundance, which will be followed by 7 years of drought here in Egypt. And Joseph says, I can decode these dreams thanks to the wisdom that God gives me. And so since so the Pharaoh says, well, what this wisdom, what should we do? You can decode the dream. Maybe you can find what to do. And he says, well, during the 7 years of abundance, let's put aside a part of the harvest. And so during the 7 years of drought, we can redistribute the grain to the population. The Pharaoh thinks it's a great idea, and in a snap of the fingers, the man who was a prisoner became prime minister, the big manager of the state. And so what does this story tell me? The first thing is the importance of interpreting the present. Now, we've all seen a few signs of climate change on a local level. I remember going to Toronto a few years ago, and people told me that, yeah, we don't have any tulips this year. In the city of Toronto, no tulips were growing because the winter was just too warm, and the bulbs didn't freeze. So then, in lots of places, there weren't any tulips. That same year, it was so warm. I went in Abitibi, in northern Quebec, and people couldn't go with their ski-doos on the lakes, which they usually did because the lakes would freeze. And then they would go on the hunting grounds and everything. And that's what they were used to, and they saw local signs that the climate was changing. And so probably you, where you live, there are signs that the climate is changing, but you see it on a local level and you only see that part. And so imagine if you were a decision maker. Imagine if you're prime minister, president, king, and you get these signs from all the land. You get it from a much wider perspective. And that's what's happening to Pharaoh. He's getting lots and lots and lots of signs, but he doesn't know how to interpret them. It's even giving him nightmares. And finally, well, once they're interpreted, thanks to Joseph, well, then he can act for the benefit of the people. So there's this idea of foreseeing and then adapting. It's a very cool story about the climate in Egypt that was changing. It's the regional climate that was changing, which is different from today because we're talking about global climate change. So yeah, is there climate change today? Oh yeah. Just one sign that's very obvious is that more than 80% of the glaciers in the world are melting. And 80%, that's on all of the continents. So it shows that it's a global trend. Also, here's a graph of the temperature history. At least, 150 years of very credible temperature records. And so we see a clear trend. We've increased the temperature of the planet by 1 degree Celsius. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but it takes a huge amount of energy to be able to warm the planet, its atmosphere, by 1 degree Celsius. It's kind of like, imagine warming the temperature of a bathtub, or let's say even an Olympic pool, with a bunch of matchboxes. You'll get a little flame, but how much energy is necessary to heat all of that just 1 degree Celsius? As a general rule, just for this type of conversation, 1 degree Celsius is 2 degrees Fahrenheit. What's the cause of the temperature rising on Earth? There are lots of consequences, which I don't need to talk about right now, but just the causes. Well, it's mostly CO2. There's also methane. There is also others, but the main one, 2/3 of the effect actually come from CO2. And we've gone from 280 parts per million, that's the concentration of CO2 in the air, and it's risen to 420. And without being a great scientist, you can just see that the temperature has risen, and the cause is the blue line, the CO2 concentration has risen. There's a direct correlation. It's caused by burning fossil fuels that were in the soil before. They were deep in the ground, and now we're just taking them and putting them in the atmosphere. It's changing the chemistry of the atmosphere. There's a higher concentration of CO2, and it acts like a blanket, keeping heat towards the surface. This is what it looks like from a global perspective. So the more the temperatures go towards warmer colors, it's because that region is warming. Now this is the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. And if we continue to 2020, obviously it would be even much warmer. Much, much warmer, because the trend is accelerating. So we're in global climate change right now. So this story about Pharaoh and his dream and Joseph decoding it, what does it tell us? It tells us we should adapt. Pharaoh's way of adapting was to keep some grain and redistribute it. But right now, if you're an island state, you need to adapt by breaking those waves, for example. People who live on the coast need to make sure the houses are higher up. If you live in a country that's already warm, have to find a way for seniors and other people to stay cool when there's a warm spell. And then in some places we're going to go towards drought, so how will we get enough water to do whatever we'd like? In other places there are going to be floods. Again, how's the infrastructure built? So we have to adapt. And we also have to mitigate, so reduce the amount of pollution. We're talking about CO2 mostly, but also methane and others. The impacts will be less if we act now. Now here's a weird one. Death is in the pot. Okay, so it's the story of Elisha. And he is a follower of Elijah. Elijah is the one who starts off this mission. He's chosen as a prophet by God and goes in different communities who still believe in Yahweh, still believe in the one God, creator of the universe. But the country is just full of pagans and worshiping idols. And so it's kind of tough because even the king, the queen want to get rid of these prophets. So when finally Elijah goes to heaven on a flaming chariot, Elisha is the one who continues. And there's this story about a soup, which is really intriguing. So he stops at this house, and everyone's excited. He's like, oh wow, the prophet is here. The prophet is here. Let's offer him something to eat. And I mean, they just have just a little tiny bit of flour. They don't have much, and they don't know what to offer. And then one person says, well, maybe we could offer him some soup. And then servants look around and like, with what? And so they go out in the wilderness and they find these wild cucumbers. And they just pick them and they fill their coat with them. And then they go back, cut them up in pieces and put them in the soup and then offer it to people. Now people have no idea what they're eating. It's just offered to them and they eat. But after the first spoonful, one person says, "Oh man of God, there is death in the pot." And they could not eat. Okay, there's already famine in the land, so that was like not good news. And plus they have the prophet there, and then, oh no, what are we going to do? turns around, takes a handful of flour, puts it in the soup, mixes it, and then everything's fine. Now, I have no idea about the chemical reaction or whatever is involved in there, but I will say one thing. It's really interesting that when we have a problem, that we confide in God and search for God's wisdom. And there's something spiritual about it, that we're in a tough spot, but man of God, what should we do? Like, there's a pandemic. God, help us get through it. What should we do to protect our fellow citizens, our neighbors? God, what's the wisest thing to do? And the other reflection I have about this story, which is actually my main point, where does food come from? Now, you're going to say the groceries, but what I mean by this is that every time we eat, do we wonder, where is this from? Like in this case, the people who sat at the table just saw soup and didn't wonder much more and just started eating, and finally saw that, hey, there's something toxic in here. It's poisonous. We're not supposed to be eating this. So how many times do we drink coffee or eat chocolate, but the producer did not get a fair salary out of it? So we're eating or drinking, and other people are suffering because of that. Also, how many times have I eaten strawberries that are loaded with pesticides? And those pesticides are not metabolized by my body. My body does not know what to do when it ingests pesticides. So it stores it with my fat because it doesn't know what to do and it can't get rid of it. So it stores it. And then at a certain point, well, sometimes it's burned. And when it is burned, it's not properly burned, and finally it doesn't react well, and that's what causes cancers. All of these weird synthetic chemicals, they are not good for our body. There's death in the pot. So we should be asking, where does it come from? And then when we ask ourselves, where does our food come from? Well, we can try to avoid pesticides and chemical fertilizers. We look for the mentioned organic. And to make sure people have fair salaries, we look for fair trade. I think that would be the wisest thing to do. Let me tell you a story about bitter water. It has to do with Moses. Moses threw the piece of wood into the water, and the water became sweet, or simply drinkable. So this comes from the story where the Hebrews just got out of Egypt, parting the Red Sea. They walk, and then they're finally free. They keep on walking through the desert, and then they don't have any water. And the desert is dry, and yeah, they have freedom, but they're going to die in the desert if they don't find water soon. Finally, they get this little puddle of water, but it's bitter, and they know they'll all get sick, so it's not a huge advantage. Moses turns to God and says, "What should I do?" And God says, well, take one of those branches and throw it in the water, and it'll become drinkable. And so, first of all, what I get from this story is that we're stuck with polluted water as well around us. And it's a huge amount of people on Earth who don't have access to clean water. That number is going down as years go by, and that is great news, but it's still an unimaginable number. People, when they have this problem, they turn towards God. Well, Moses turns towards God. And then, really cool thing, God turns Moses' head to look toward the environment. So it's like, oh no, what do we do? Take a branch from the tree. Oh, okay. what happens? The water is purified and it's drinkable. And we should be advocating for drinkable water because it's essential to life. Now, did a bit of research and found that there is a tree in Egypt and the peninsula in the Near East called Moringa oleifera, and it can remove the turbidity from the water. So 1 gram of, the seeds actually, is good for 4 liters of water. And it just makes everything precipitate, go to the bottom, and then the water becomes drinkable. And it's actually an amazing tree. When I discovered it, I thought, oh, this is really cool. So we can eat the beans from that tree. We can eat the leaves, the bark, as I just said, and the beans. They can be put in water to take away the turbidity. It's a miracle plant. It's really cool. So interesting research right there, and it goes like beyond the story of Moses with the bitter water. Just to finish off, UNICEF doesn't sell that tree, but sells water purification tablets. And if ever you want to make a donation somewhere, we all need drinkable water, and this is one of the very practical ways to give drinkable water to people. Wonderful invention in the past decades, and now it's become more and more accessible.